When a father comes home from deployment and his 10-year-old daughter nervously confesses a chilling secret about her mother, he assumes it's just the stress of being apart. But as he digs deeper, his blood runs cold, and he realizes his family is caught in a web of betrayal and danger. What happens next is a relentless fight for justice and survival. James Parker stepped out of the cab, setting his boots onto the cracked pavement of his quiet neighborhood in Charleston. The evening sun cast a warm amber glow, and for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. His crisp uniform was neat, his duffel bag heavy on his shoulder, but none of that mattered. His heart raced at the thought of holding his daughter, Sophie, in his arms again. She had been the one thing keeping him grounded through the sleepless nights overseas. As he unlocked the door, he barely had a second before Sophie ran into him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Daddy!" Sophie's voice was high with emotion, her small frame shaking against him. James dropped his bag, lifting her into his arms, squeezing her tight. "Hey, sweetheart. I missed you so much." "I missed you too." She buried her face into his chest, and for a moment, everything felt right. They sat together in the living room, the air filled with the familiar scent of cinnamon from a candle on the mantel. Sophie had grown since he last saw her, her features slightly sharper, her voice carrying more maturity than before. But something else tugged at James, something he couldn't quite place. She was fidgeting, her gaze darting toward the hallway as if she was afraid of being overheard. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked, resting a hand on her shoulder. Sophie hesitated, her lips pressing together as though she was debating something. Finally, she whispered, "Dad, I need to tell you something." James's chest tightened. "You can tell me anything." Sophie swallowed hard, glancing toward the dark hallway. "It's about Mom. While you were gone, I heard things." James frowned, straightening up. "What do you mean?" "From her room. At first, I thought she was just talking to someone on the phone, but the noises weren't normal. And sometimes, I heard another voice, a man's voice. I think he was in the house." A cold wave rolled over James. He stared at Sophie, his mind spinning. "Are you sure? Did you see anyone?" "No, but I heard enough to know something wasn't right. I was scared to ask her. I didn't know if I should tell you." James took a slow, deep breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. "You did the right thing, Sophie." She looked up at him with wide, searching eyes. "You're not mad at me?" "Of course not," he said, pulling her into a hug. "You're brave for telling me. I'll take care of it, okay? You don't need to worry." That night, after tucking Sophie into bed, James sat alone in the dim living room, replaying her words over and over. He had trusted his wife Rachel for years. They had built a life together, raising their daughter in a home filled with love and stability. But now, that foundation had a crack he couldn't ignore. He thought back to the missed calls during deployment, the rushed conversations, the vague excuses. At the time, he had chalked it up to the stress of long-distance separation. But now, it felt like something darker lurked beneath. James clenched his jaw, staring at the framed wedding photo on the mantel. He had faced enemies on the battlefield, but this was personal. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The next morning, James chose observation over confrontation. He watched Rachel closely, noting every detail, the way she kept her phone close, her hushed tones when taking calls, the sudden absences. One afternoon, when Rachel left to run errands, James sat at her desk and opened her laptop. Within minutes, he found encrypted messages sent through a platform he didn't recognize, along with large financial withdrawals from their joint account, all made during his deployment. His gut twisted. Something was wrong, and it was bigger than just an affair. Later that evening, he spoke to Sophie again. "Sweetheart, do you remember anything else?" She hesitated, her small fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress. "Mom talked on the phone a lot. She said things about finishing the job and something about your pension." James felt his stomach drop. His pension? That wasn't just infidelity, that was motive. He needed proof. He installed hidden cameras in key areas of the house and reached out to an old friend, Detective Carlos Ramirez. Over a secure call, he laid out what he had found. "I think Rachel's planning something, Carlos. I don't have enough to go to the police yet, but I know she's up to something." "Be careful, James," Carlos warned. "You don't know who else might be involved." The following day, James followed Rachel as she drove to a secluded cafe on the outskirts of town. Parking at a safe distance, he watched through the window as she sat across from a man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a hardened expression. Their interaction wasn't romantic, it was businesslike. Documents exchanged hands. James snapped photos, his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't just a lover, this was a co-conspirator. That night, after Rachel fell asleep, James retrieved her laptop again. What he found made his blood run cold. Emails between her and the man, David Langston, outlining their plan. They referred to him in coded terms, discussing a staged accident, his death. The lake is a good place. A fall from the cliffs, make it look natural. Rachel had responded, it has to be quick. The payout depends on it. James clenched his fists, the words blurring before him. This wasn't a betrayal, it was a death sentence. And he was the target. The next morning, Rachel suggested they take Sophie on a weekend trip to a remote cabin. We could use the family time, she said sweetly. James forced a smile. That sounds perfect. He arranged for Sophie to stay with a trusted friend that weekend. Then he called Carlos. They're making their move, James said. I need backup. Carlos assured him officers would be stationed nearby, ready to intervene. James played along with Rachel's plan, but as they hiked toward the cliffs overlooking the lake, he turned to her with a knowing smirk. Let's skip the pretense. David's waiting, isn't he? Rachel's face paled. I don't know what you... Cut the act. James's voice was ice. I've got your emails. I know everything. Before she could respond, David emerged from the trees, gun in hand. Should have stayed clueless, Parker. But James was ready. With a swift motion, he knocked the gun aside, striking David in the jaw. They grappled, fists flying, but James's training won out. He pinned David to the ground just as sirens echoed in the distance. Rachel crumbled, sobbing, as officers cuffed them both. As they were led away, Rachel turned to him, her voice a desperate whisper. James, I never wanted. Don't, he cut her off, his expression unreadable. You made your choice. Back at home, James sat with Sophie, brushing her hair from her face. Mom made bad choices, sweetheart. But you and me? We're going to be okay. Sophie leaned into him. I know, Daddy. For a moment, silence settled between them, warm and reassuring. Then James's phone buzzed. It was Carlos. James, we need to talk. David's not just a hired hand. He's connected to something bigger. Rachel wasn't working alone. James's breath caught in his throat. What are you saying? I'm saying this isn't over. James looked down at Sophie, peaceful in his arms, and felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. He had won this battle, but the war had just begun. A sharp rap at his door made him stiffen. It was late, too late for visitors. Carefully, he laid Sophie down on the couch and grabbed the gun he kept in the drawer. Every muscle in his body tensed as he moved toward the door. Another knock. More urgent this time. James pressed his back to the wall and peered through the peephole. A man in a dark coat stood outside, his features obscured by the dim porch light. Who is it? James called, keeping his voice steady. A pause. Then, a voice he didn't recognize. Mr. Parker, you don't know me, but we need to talk. It's about Rachel. His grip tightened on the gun. She's in custody. There's nothing left to say. The man exhaled sharply. That's where you're wrong. She wasn't the mastermind. She was just another pawn. A chill ran down James's spine. And who are you? The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The only chance you have to keep your daughter safe. James hesitated for only a second before unlocking the door, gun still in hand. The man stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Start talking, James ordered. The man nodded. All right, but you should know, time is running out. Outside, a black car idled down the street, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. Watching. Waiting.